I greet you, ladies and gentlemen, as I start my presentation on questionnaires. Questionnaires are one of the most important and most popular research instruments that many students and non-student researchers tend to rely on to gather data, that is standardized data. So I will just define a questionnaire, but my definition is what I call a working definition. It's not an exhaustive definition. A questionnaire is a series of questions designed to elicit information which is filled in by all participants in the sample. This can be gathered either by oral interview or by a written questionnaire. So it's one of the most common type of research instruments, especially when one is interested in gathering responses which they want to compare among participants or across a spectrum of a population or a cross section. There are what are called pencil paper questionnaires, which can be sent to a large number of people and saves the researcher time and money, as well as other resources. When a person is responding to a questionnaire anonymously, in the comfort of their office or in the comfort of their homes, they are more likely to give objective and truthful answers. And then we have got, these internet surveys or web-based questionnaires. This is a new initiative which has become popular with the internet-based research. We have got, organizations or entities such as SurveyMonkey or SurveyMonkey, which are from time to time are used as platforms for sending out questionnaires, and also Google Forms. Some researchers, they structure their questionnaires using Google Forms as a platform or as a tool for eliciting responses from their potential respondents. So I've got quite a number of advantages of questionnaires, but I'll just zero in on 4. The first advantage of a questionnaire is that a questionnaire is a simple method of collecting or obtaining data, as they can elicit information from respondents without the physical presence or the active participation of the researcher or the gatherer of information. That's advantage number 1. Advantage number 2 is that questionnaires are convenient in the sense that, especially in the case of web-based questionnaires and paper questionnaires, the potential respondent or the respondent can answer them at their own time. Usually there is a time period or a time frame within which a questionnaire is to be answered. So they are quite convenient to both the researcher and the researchee, if there is such a word, or the respondent. And then the third advantage is that questionnaires allow researchers or the researcher to collect data from a widely scattered sample. And then number 4 is that questionnaires enable the researcher to gather standardized responses, especially questionnaires with closed questions, a type of questions called closed questions. And then, of course, the advantages, there are more than what I just stated, but these are some of the advantages. And, responses to questionnaires, especially for closed-ended questions, they are easy to analyze using, analytical softwares or software packages such as SPSS and Stata. What are the disadvantages or demerits of questionnaires? Number one, the responses to a questionnaire sometimes may lack depth, especially if the questionnaire is just dominated by closed-ended questions, as opposed to, a combination between open-ended questionnaires. I mean questions and closed-ended questions. The second disadvantage is that some respondents, especially if the questionnaire is very long, have this tendency of omitting or disregarding certain items. These may be items that they are either uncomfortable about or items where they won't be able to remember the facts and they just tell themselves, I'll fill in this after verifying the facts. But at the end of the day, the researcher comes and when they want to collect the questionnaire, they just put the questionnaire in an envelope, or maybe they just staple it. If the research assistants of the main researcher come and they just send a questionnaire which is incompletely filled in. Number three, some items may force the respondents to select responses that are not their actual choice, especially if the response or the responses to the questions or the way the questions are structured is such that the questions are structured in a poor way. You may have a situation where you've got suggested answers or leading questions, or questions which seem to suggest a way in which they ought to be answered. So the responses of the respondents might not be entirely objective. The fourth disadvantage is that when the questionnaires are long, it sort of compromises the questionnaire response rate. When the questionnaires are short, again, the information that can be gathered will be sometimes shallow. So there is that dilemma and that trade-off between the response rate and the depth of the responses that one obtains when they are gathering information through questionnaires. Whereas there is a reliance, especially before COVID, on paper questionnaires, the printing of them may be very costly, and as well as their distribution and also the collection. But when questionnaires are sent through the internet via email or via SurveyMonkey or via Google Forms or any other platform, it becomes easier for the questionnaires to be distributed effortlessly to hundreds of thousands of people, hundreds of respondents, without incurring much in terms of additional costs, save for the cost of the internet. But where there is Wi-Fi freely available, paid for by institutions, the researcher may not actually pay anything literally to send out questionnaires and also to receive them through the internet. Some items may be misunderstood, leading to wrong responses, or lengthy and meandering responses which are almost meaningless to the research. And then the other challenge with questionnaires is that in a community, let us assume you're investigating the effect of domestic violence on the welfare of people in a home. If someone is using a questionnaire to gather such data, the challenge is that the people who may be more of victims of domestic violence, like people who are illiterate, who are not able to read and write and respond to questionnaires, they might be omitted entirely from the sample. The other challenge is that where questionnaires are used exclusively and other methods like interviews, other more interactive methods like interviews or observation are not used, certain people who are demanding a certain product may be completely omitted because they may not be able to respond to a questionnaire. So how are questionnaires developed, ladies and gentlemen? I don't mean to cover each and every point, but I just mean to cover the main points with this short presentation. The first point to note is that to develop a questionnaire, one needs to read the literature about the topic. That is the theoretical or conceptual literature and the empirical literature. This may assist the researcher to actually locate questionnaires which have been used by other researchers when they were researching a similar topic. The second point is that open-ended questions are preferable than closed-ended questions since they reflect respondents' attitudes and feelings which are expressed in his own words. But the challenge with open-ended questions, they are not easy to analyze. You need to use your atlas or your NVivo, where you don't get standardized responses, or the analysis may be affected by the analyst or the analyzer or the researcher. But where you are dealing with closed-ended questions, you get standardized responses which are easy to analyze using software. And then every item on the questionnaire should relate to the topic under study, which means before a person actually crafts a questionnaire, they must be very clear about the conceptual framework, which I covered in another video, which I published recently. Now, what are the criteria for good questionnaires? What are the criteria of a good questionnaire? Number one, it is clarity of language. The questionnaire must not be a questionnaire which is dominated by questions which are verbose. Questions which are verbose instead of simplicity. Someone uses archaic words, very long and complicated statements, meandering statements, or technical language. Even if you are gathering information and you are doing engineering, the understanding is that when you are gathering responses, you won't be gathering them from everyone who is an engineer. Even if you are gathering them from engineers, engineers are not all of the same qualification or knowledge. So it becomes imperative to use just clear language, which is straight to the point. And then number two, it's very imperative for the researcher to be clear about their research objective, the main research objective. If the researcher has got a multi-pronged study with the many objectives that are being pursued by the same questionnaire, there is likely to be the problem of shallowness in the responses. That's the challenge. The responses are more likely to be shallow because the researcher would be seeking to gather a lot of information, to speak to many objectives when it is important that one main objective be actually pursued. And then the other criterion is that grammar, spelling, and sentence construction must be quite good. Where someone is not sure of their language, you may need the services of a content editor or an English language editor, whatever language you are using to research. And then characteristics of a good questionnaire. A good questionnaire has got a good title, a well-stated title. The title should not be long. It should not be long. It should not be too brief. It should be sufficiently informative. And a good questionnaire, before it delves into the questions, it has got a statement of purpose which sort of introduces the potential respondent or the person who is evaluating the questionnaire, like a lecturer or a peer reviewer or whatever. Any person who is reading the questionnaire, they must be able to see the statement of purpose. Why is the questionnaire being distributed? What does the researcher hope to achieve in distributing the questionnaire? Number three, a good questionnaire assures the respondents about the confidentiality of responses. Number four, it is designed to achieve the objective of the study. Number five, it has a clear direction. Number six, There are no double negative questions. Number 7, it avoids double barrels question or double barreled questions. I talked about a double barreled research topic, and then now we're talking of a double barreled question. You can think of your own examples. A question which requires more than one response when it is just the same question or one question. So the design of the responses must be such that it can facilitate easy tabulation of the responses for data analysis purposes. And then when we are looking at the types of questions that appear in a questionnaire, we have got closed-ended questions. These questions, they just allow the respondent to choose one of the given alternatives, sometimes many. We have seen when we are, when we are enrolling for certain services or when we are acquiring certain services, they ask you to tick the things that you like. Sometimes you can tick more than 5 things out of 7 things. It's not always the case that you choose one response. Sometimes you can choose many things. Like if the questionnaire says, what are your levels of education? If it doesn't say what's your highest level of education, then it means I can tick from primary school, secondary school, degree, master's degree, PhD, and so on. And then we have got open-ended questions. These are more appropriate for, fields or disciplines like humanities, where a person is studying maybe a topic like in psychology or social work or sociology or political science, where there is need for people to really express their opinion or to express their condition, whatever condition they may be going through. So before I finish this video, I just want to cover also this research tool, which is called an interview. An interview involves either a structured or unstructured verbal communication between the researcher and the research subject, or between the researcher and the respondent, or between the information gatherer and the target sample or population where information is being gathered from. In quantitative research or survey research, interviews are more structured than in qualitative research. So that's one thing which you need to note. In banking or finance, and in economics as well, depending on the themes in economics that are being investigated. If someone is investigating these positivist, straight to the point, or even quantitative themes in economics, it becomes imperative for the interview to be actually structured. But where one wants to gather the feelings, the opinions, and the preferences of the respondents, then the interview may be unstructured. The interviewer might spontaneously interact with the interviewee or the research subject. So types of interviews, we have got unstructured interviews. These are just conversational interviews. They may be very long. Sometimes they can span days and are conducted in a usual setting when people are having supper or lunch, or when they are just relaxing and watching television. Such interviews are common in sociology, in psychology, in psychiatry, and also they are common in anthropology, where researchers, they're interested in gathering a lot of attributes or qualities about a certain population in order to understand what is going on. And then we've got structured interviews. These always operate within a formal written instrument, which is called an interview schedule or an interview guide. An interview schedule or an interview guide is just a write-up. We have seen journalists who be anchoring news or who will be anchoring talk shows on television and nowadays on YouTube. They'll be having a list of questions. Sometimes that list of questions, it will be represented by certain keywords. The moment the interviewer sees certain keywords, they are able to know the kind of question that they need to ask. Sometimes the interviewer can be actually carrying an iPad and referring to their iPad or their phone in order to ask very pertinent questions. Because in these very dynamic interviews, the interviewer might actually get questions from people who are actually editors or senior producers or other people who may be involved in an interview. So there is an interview schedule or an interview guide, which is just a set of questions, standardized questions or carefully crafted questions that are meant to elicit information from the interviewee. And we also have face-to-face interviews where the researcher has got the distinct advantage of seeing the facial expression of the respondents as they respond to certain questions. The disadvantage of this kind of interview is that it may be impractical for large samples or for people who are very busy because they might not have time to sit around with the interviewer in order to interact. It involves a great deal of sacrifice on the part of the interview. And then telephone interviews. These were common in the past 2 decades. But recently, we have had these interviews that are conducted using social media tools like WhatsApp. And recently, we started having, Twitter spaces where people, they can interview each other using Twitter spaces. We also have Facebook. On Facebook, you can conduct an interview through a video call or through some other means. Before I conclude this short lecture, I want to cover some of the merits of interviews. Number 1, data from an interview are usually usable. You are able to do follow-ups to responses in an interview. Number 2, the depth of responses can be assured, which is why interviews are a favored method for news organizations or for journalists. Journalists, they may send questions in advance, but still they would want to do an interview with you if your schedule is not very busy, so that they can probe further when you give certain responses. Number 3, in an exploratory study, the interview technique provides basis for the formation of a questionnaire. Number 4, clarification is possible. Number 5, no items are overlooked. Number 6, there is a higher proportion of responses which is obtained, especially in the case of telephone or video interviews on Facebook or other types of interviews like face-to-face interviews. The mere presence of the interviewer enhances the possibility that the interviewee is going to respond to questions that are put across to them. And then the disadvantages. I've got 4 or so disadvantages of interviews. The first disadvantage of interviews is that out of pressure, the interviewee may give non-factual responses just for the sake of progress, so that they are able to move from one stage to another. Number 2, biases may result. Number 3, the use of this technique to gather data is time-consuming. It requires researchers who have got a lot of time. And number 3, it may be very costly where the sample is scattered, because the researcher will either need to use public transport to move around, or they will need to use a lot of fuel in order to reach all the members of the sample that are supposed to be interviewed. So I believe with what I've quickly covered, it is enough for today. So what I'm going to do tomorrow is that I'll just do a video, a short video on data analysis, because I covered that section, but I'll just do a short video on data analysis. But before I do that, I will do another video on, research methodology, where someone is estimating econometric models. We can't have a standardized lecture on how you come up with an econometric model, but I'll try by all means to summarize the salient features or the key points that one has to take into account when they are producing an econometric model. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining in. I appreciate your sacrifice of time to listen into my video. For those who haven't subscribed, who have been watching my videos and enjoying the kind of stuff that I share in these videos, I encourage you to subscribe and also to share this material with your colleagues. I'm going to be throwing in more videos on a variety of issues. Very soon, I will be demonstrating data analysis, still using SPSS to come up with the curvilinear regressions, to come up with logarithmic regressions, and so on and so forth. Thank you so much for listening, and I appreciate it.